If you ever raise horses long enough, you learn that the most dangerous animal on the property is the one you can't read. Not the stud that bites, not the mare that kicks. The dangerous one is the quiet one, standing still, watching you with an expression you can't put a name to, because a thing you can't name is a thing you can't prepare for. I bought that lesson cheap, a long time ago, from a stallion that fooled me into thinking he was gentle. I paid for the next one, dear. And I paid for it not from a horse at all, but from a woman who walked up my road one October morning with dust on her moccasins and a face like weathered stone, and stood at my fence looking at a gray gelding as if the animal were the last living piece of her own heart. I did what any man does when a stranger stops at his fence and studies his stock. I asked the only question I knew how to ask. Looking to buy a horse? I have turned that morning over in my mind more times than I have counted cattle, and I have counted a great many cattle. I keep a ledger, you understand. Have kept one since I was a boy, every dollar in, every dollar out, every foaling and every death, written down in a cramped hand so nobody could ever tell me I misremembered. I trusted the ledger more than I trusted my own memory, more than I trusted men, more than I trusted God, if I'm honest, and I was rarely honest about that part. But there is no column in a ledger for what that woman said to me. There is no line where it fits. I have tried to write it down 100 times, and every time my pencil stops, because to write it plain would be to make it small, and it was not small. So let me tell it the long way, the way it happened. Sit still and I'll get to her answer, but you'll understand it better if you know the man who asked the question first and how little he deserved the answer he got. The morning it started, I was 3 horses poorer than I needed to be and 1 bad winter from losing the whole enterprise. And I knew it the way you know a tooth is going to have to come out. A dull ache you keep testing with your tongue, hoping you're wrong. My name is Elias Crane. In the fall of that year, I was 51 years old and I ran a small horse operation on the wrong side of a valley in the New Mexico territory, 40-some head when they were counted generous, half that when they were counted honest. My wife had been dead 11 years. My son had gone to Colorado to work a mine and wrote me twice a year, both times to ask if I needed anything, which was his gentle way of finding out whether he'd have to come bury me. I always wrote back that I was fine. The ledger said otherwise. The ledger always said otherwise. That October I had a buyer coming from Santa Fe, a freighting concern that wanted sound geldings, broke and quiet, 4 of them, and they were paying enough that 4 horses would carry me through to spring. I'd picked my 4. 3 were easy. The 4th was the gray. I want to tell you about the gray, because he's the middle of this whole thing, and because I've never been able to talk about him without stopping partway through to breathe. He came to me by an ugly road. 2 years before, the army had run a sweep through the country to the south. You'll know the kind, or you won't, and if you don't, I envy you. The particulars don't matter to my story except this. When the army moves people, they don't always know what to do with the animals. Horses got scattered. Some got shot. Some got sold cheap through a middleman in Las Cruces to anybody with cash, no questions, no papers, no history that anybody would say out loud. I bought the gray off that middleman for $11 because he was thin, and I felt his ribs and I thought, this is a good animal that's had a bad year, same as me. I was right about the good animal. I never once guessed how bad the year had been or whose year it was. He was a big gray gelding near 16 hands, dappled dark over the shoulders and going lighter down the flanks, with a black muzzle and a way of holding his head that made grown men stop and look at him twice. He was smart. Too smart, the kind of smart that watches you decide something before you've finished deciding it. He didn't spook. He didn't fight. He did every single thing I asked of him, correctly, the first time, and he did it all with a distance in his eye that I told myself was just his nature. It was not his nature. I know that now. At the time I only knew that when I worked him I felt watched, and when I put him up at night I felt, somehow, forgiven, and I could not for the life of me have told you what I'd done that needed forgiving. I named him Smoke, for lack of better, and I put him in the string for Santa Fe because he was the finest gelding I'd ever owned, and I needed the money, and a man does not keep his finest thing when he is 1 winter from ruin. That is the arithmetic of a hard life. You sell the thing you love because the thing you love is worth the most. I had it all decided. The ledger had a line for it, 4 geld, Santa Fe sold, and a space where the number would go. Then the woman came up my road. I saw her from the corral, and my first thought, I'm ashamed of it, but I promised to tell this straight. My first thought was trouble. Not because of who she was. Because a person on foot, alone, that far from any town, is almost always a person in some kind of desperate condition, and desperate conditions have a way of becoming your problem whether you invite them or not. She walked like she'd been walking a long time, not limping, worse than limping. She walked like walking had stopped being an event and become a permanent state, the way water flows because that's what water does. Her clothes were a mix, a faded calico blouse that had come off some settlement trader's shelf, a wrapped skirt, moccasins gone gray with dust. Her hair was pulled back and threaded through with gray of its own. She was younger than me, I thought, but not by as much as her carriage first suggested. Hard years put age on a person that their birthday hasn't earned yet. She was Apache. I want to say that plainly and without dressing it up, because in that country in that year it meant something to say it, and most of what it was supposed to mean was ugly, and I'd absorbed my share of the ugliness the way you absorb the weather you're born into without ever choosing it. I'd have told you if you asked that I bore no man ill will. I'd also have crossed the street. Both things were true, and I never once made them argue with each other. She stopped at my fence. Not the gate, the fence, 40 feet down the line at the spot where the corral came closest to the road. She put one hand on the top rail, and she looked into the corral, and she went completely still. I followed her eyes. She was looking at Smoke. He'd lifted his head from the hay. He was looking back at her, and there was something in the set of his ears, some fractional forward lean of his whole body, that I had never once seen him give to me in 2 years of feeding him, doctoring him, working him, loving him in my closed-off way. And I felt it land in my stomach like a swallowed stone before my mind had caught up to what my body already understood. I walked over, I made my voice easy. I had done 1,000 horse deals, and I knew how to sound like a man who wasn't worried about anything, which was a skill I'd developed precisely because I was always worried about everything. "Morning," I said. She didn't look at me, she kept looking at the horse. "Long way out here on foot," I said. "You come from the settlement." Nothing, the horse took a step toward the fence. I want to be clear, Smoke did not come to people. Smoke tolerated people. Smoke had in 2 years come to the fence for exactly one thing, which was grain, and I did not have grain, and he came anyway, one slow step and then another, until he stood at the rail with his black muzzle not a foot from her hand. She still hadn't touched him, her hand stayed on the rail. But I saw it trembling now, a fine tremor she was working to hold still, and I saw her jaw set the way a person's jaw sets when they have decided they are not going to make a sound no matter what it costs them. And I careful fool, a man who read the market better than he read anything alive, I did the thing I knew how to do. I made it a transaction, because a transaction I understood. A transaction had rules and columns and an outcome you could write down. "He's a fine one, isn't he?" I said. "Best I've got an eye for horse flesh, I can see that." I settled my forearms on the rail a respectful distance from her, and I looked at Smoke like I was appraising him, though God knows I'd appraised him 100 times. "You looking to buy a horse?" She turned her head then, slow, and she looked at me for the first time, full in the face, with eyes so dark and so steady, and so far past the reach of my easy salesman's voice that the rest of my patter died in my throat. "No," she said. Her English was quiet and careful, each word set down like she was placing stones across a river, testing each one before she trusted her weight to it. "I have come to buy back my son." I have told you there is no line in my ledger for what she said. Now you know the words, but words on a page are not the thing. You'd have had to be standing where I stood, with the October sun already going thin and yellow, with the smell of horse and dust, and the coming cold in it, with that big gray gelding pressed to the rail reaching toward her like a plant reaches toward a window. You'd have had to see her say it, in that flat, quiet voice with the tremor underneath, to feel it land the way it landed. "Buy back my son." I opened my mouth. I don't know what I meant to say. Something about how I only sold horses, ma'am, some reflexive, stupid thing to put us back on the map I understood. But I looked at Smoke, and I looked at her, and the two of them were looking at each other, and the map I understood folded up and blew away like a paper in the wind. "The horse," I said, it came out cracked. "His name is not the horse," she said. "His name is—" And she said a word I could not repeat back to you now if you paid me. A word with a shape my mouth wasn't built for, soft in the middle and rising at the end, and the gray gelding, my gray gelding, Smoke, who came to no one, dropped his head over the rail and pressed his forehead flat against her chest. She put both arms around his big gray head. and she made no sound. But her whole body was shaking now, silently, the way a house shakes when something heavy has come loose deep inside it. And the horse stood there and let her hold him. And I stood there like a post I'd sunk myself into the ground. And I understood that I had walked up to this fence to sell a horse, and I had instead walked into the middle of somebody's grief, uninvited, still holding my little salesman's smile like a hat I'd forgotten to take off. I took it off, metaphorically. I straightened up and I got quiet, which was the only decent thing I did in that first quarter hour, and I'm still glad I did it. After a while, a minute, 5 minutes, I couldn't tell you, she let the horse go. She stepped back from the rail. She wiped her face once with the heel of her hand, briskly, the way you'd wipe a table, embarrassed to have been caught being human in front of a stranger. Then she folded her hands in front of her and looked at me, and I saw her put the stone face back on, one piece at a time, and I understood that the stone face was not who she was. It was armor. She'd worn it up my road because a woman alone in that country war, whatever would keep her alive. And I felt a shame so sudden and so total that it nearly buckled my knees, because I'd have crossed the street from her, and she knew I would have, and she'd come up my road anyway because she had no choice, and the thing she'd come for was standing in my corral with my name on him in my ledger. That horse, she said, belonged to my son. He raised him from a colt. She spoke slowly, giving me each fact and then waiting to see whether I'd argue, whether I'd get ugly, whether I'd call her a liar or a thief. When the soldiers came, they took our horses. My son was taken to a different place than the horses. I did not see either of them again. Your son, I started. Is dead, she said, flat, no warning. She laid it down between us like a stone across the river, and she did not test her weight on it. She just stepped across because she'd made that crossing so many times already that the crossing no longer required care. At the place they sent him, there was sickness. I was told this. I was not there. The wind moved across the corral. Smoke shifted his weight and blew out a long breath, and it was the loudest sound in the world. I looked for the horse, she said, because the horse I could still find, my son I cannot find. But the horse, and here, for the first time, something cracked in the careful, flat voice, one hairline fracture. The horse is the last thing his hands touched that is still living. I have followed him 2 years, trader to trader. I was told a man named Crane bought a gray from the middleman at Las Cruces. I have walked 11 days. She stopped. She had said what she came to say. And then she asked me the question that I have never fully answered, not to her, not to myself, not in any ledger I ever kept. What will you take for him? Now, here is the ugly part, and I'll not skip it, because a story that only shows you a man's decent minutes is a lie, and I've told enough of those. My first feeling, my very first, before the better feelings caught up, was relief. Because I thought I saw a way out. I thought, she has no money. A woman who's walked 11 days doesn't have 4 horses worth of freighting money in a purse. I thought, I can be kind. I can say something soft. I can tell her I'm sorry for her loss and send her back down the road, and I can still sell smoke to the man from Santa Fe, and I can be a decent fellow about it, and I can go to sleep tonight the same man who woke up this morning. That was my first honest feeling. Relief that her tragedy came without the power to cost me anything. I have spent a long time being ashamed of that. I've mostly stopped, not because it stopped being shameful, but because a man can only carry so much shame and still get his chores done. But I set it down here because you should know the size of what I started with to measure what came after. Ma'am, I said, and I heard my own voice reaching for the soft, dishonest place. I'm awful sorry for your... What will you take for him? She said again, not louder. But she cut across my softness like a knife through a rope, and I understood she did not want my sorrow. She had a river of her own sorrow and did not need to borrow mine. She wanted a number. She wanted a transaction, the very thing I'd been so proud of understanding. Because a transaction was a thing she could do, and grief was a thing that could only be endured, and she had come all this way to do something at last. And she reached into the front of her blouse and drew out a small cloth bundle, and she unfolded it on the flat of her palm, and I looked at what she had. Coins, a few. Old ones worn, some of them not even American, a Mexican piece, a coin I didn't know, a couple of worn silver dollars. And with the coins, a ring. A thin band with a small green stone, the kind of ring a poor man buys a woman he loves because it's the finest thing he can reach. And a knife, a good knife, a working knife with a bone handle worn to the shape of a hand that wasn't hers, a man's hand, a hand that was gone. She had brought me everything she owned in the world. She had laid it out on her palm in the October sun. And the total of it, I did the arithmetic without meaning to, the ledger in me running its columns even here, even now. The total of it might have come to $9 if I was generous, and I needed 40, and I had a buyer for 40 coming Thursday, and it was Tuesday. That is all I have, she said. She said it without shame. That's what undid me, I think. She said it the way you'd report the weather. That is all I have, not please, not have mercy. Just the fact laid out flat, and the question underneath it that she was too proud to say and too desperate not to mean. Is it enough? Is my whole life enough to buy back the last living thing my son ever touched? And I stood there, Elias Crane, careful man, ledger man, one winter from ruin. And I looked at a green ring and a dead man's knife and 4 coins in the palm of a woman who'd walked 11 days. And I felt the whole architecture of my careful life lean over sideways like a barn in a flood. Because I knew, standing there, that whatever I said next was going to be the truest thing I'd ever said about who I actually was. Not who I told the ledger I was. Not who I told my son I was in those twice-a-year letters. Who I actually was, when a thing was asked of me that cost me more than I could afford. I opened my mouth. And I want to tell you I said the right thing. I want to tell you I swept the coins aside and said, "Keep your ring, ma'am, take the horse, God go with you." I didn't, not yet. That's a different part of the story, and I'll get to it, and it did not come easy, and it did not come clean. What I said, what actually came out of my mouth, in the October sun, with the gray horse reaching over the fence between us, was the smallest, most cowardly, most honest thing a frightened man ever said. I said, "I've got a buyer coming Thursday." She didn't flinch. I'll give her that, and I'll give it to her forever. A lesser person would have flinched. She just looked at me, and something moved behind her eyes, some recalculation, some old familiar arrival at a place she'd been before, and I realized she had expected this. She had walked 11 days expecting to be told no. She had built the no into the journey. The no was not a surprise to her. The only surprise, maybe, was going to be if it ever turned out to be a yes, and nothing in her life had trained her to expect that particular surprise. "He is a valuable horse," she said, agreeing with me, handing me my own excuse back, polished so I wouldn't have to feel bad about it. "You are a man of business." "I am," I said, and it came out like a confession. She nodded slowly. She began very carefully to fold the cloth back around her coins and her ring and her dead son's knife. Her hands were steady now. She'd put the armor all the way back on. She was going to thank me, I realized. She was going to thank me for my time and turn around and walk back down my road. 11 days back to wherever she'd come from, having laid her whole life on her palm in the sun and been told it wasn't enough. And she was going to do it with dignity, without a single word of reproach. Because reproach was a luxury, and she'd sold all her luxuries a long time ago to buy the strength it took to keep walking. Smoke made a sound. I'd never heard him make it before. Low in his chest, almost too quiet to hear. A sound a horse makes for another horse in the dark. A sound that means don't go. He pressed against the rail. He stretched his neck out after her as she stepped back. And the woman stopped folding the cloth and closed her eyes and stood very still, and I watched a 2 years' walk of held-together strength come within one thread of breaking right there against my fence. I looked at the horse. I looked at the woman. I looked at the little cloth bundle with a green ring in it. And somewhere in my chest, in the cramped, closed room where I kept the parts of myself I didn't let out to do business, something I'd bricked up a long time ago started, very quietly, to come apart. I want to tell you I decided right then. I didn't. I was a coward for longer than I'm proud of. But that was the moment the wall took its first crack, standing at a fence, between a grieving woman and a grieving horse, holding a ledger in my head that had, for the first time in my life, no line for what was being asked of me. "Wait," I heard myself say. She opened her eyes. I didn't know what came after wait. I only knew I couldn't watch her walk back down that road. Not yet, not without. Some accounting I couldn't find the number for. "Wait," I said again, stupidly, a man with his hand out toward a door that was already closing. "Just wait, it's near noon, you've walked 11 days. I swallowed. My voice was doing something I couldn't control. At least come in and eat. Before whatever you decide. You've walked 11 days. A man doesn't send a person back down the road on an empty stomach. Even a..." I stopped. I'd been about to say even a stranger, and I heard how thin it was, and I didn't say it. She studied me for a long moment, weighing it. Weighing me, whether the offer was a trap, whether kindness from a man like me was a thing that ever came free, whether she had the strength to sit at a stranger's table and be beholden. I saw all of it move across her face and then go still. "Why?" she said. Not "thank you," not "all right." Just why? The most honest question in the world, and I didn't have an honest answer because I didn't know yet. I only knew that the ledger in my chest had stopped running its columns, for the first time in 51 years, and in the silence where the numbers used to be, there was a sound I'd been not hearing for a very long time, and it took me a moment to recognize it as my own heart. "I don't know," I said. And God help me, it was the truest thing I'd said all morning, and she heard that it was true, and something in the stone face eased, not softened, not yet, but eased, the way a fist eases when it's too tired to stay a fist, and she gave the smallest nod I ever saw a human being give. "I will eat," she said. Behind her, the gray horse blew out a long breath and finally lowered his head back to the hay. I turned toward the house. My legs didn't feel like mine. And as I walked, I found myself doing the thing I always did when the world got too big. I started composing the ledger line in my head, the line I'd write tonight, the account of the day, and I got as far as 2's. Oct. And then I stopped, standing in my own yard, because I could not for the life of me find the words for what column any of this belonged in. I still can't. I've kept that ledger 40 years. There's a page from that autumn with the whole week filled in neat and square, every dollar accounted for. Except Tuesday. Tuesday is blank. I've left it blank on purpose all these years. Because some things you can't write down without making them smaller. And I decided, walking to my house with an Apache woman behind me and a gray horse at my back, and my whole careful life coming quietly apart at the seams. I decided that this one I'd remember instead. My house was not a house that expected company. I understood that the moment I opened the door and saw it through her eyes, a one-room thing with a stove and a table and a bed in the corner and a shelf of accounts, a widower's house, the house of a man who had stopped tidying for anyone but himself a decade ago. There was a smell to it I'd stopped smelling, cold ash, old coffee leather, the particular staleness of a life lived alone and indoors in winter. I saw her take it in from the doorway. She didn't step inside right away. She stood on the threshold and looked, and I understood she was doing what I would have done, reading the room for what it told her about the man, deciding whether it was safe. I don't know what she decided, but after a moment she stepped in, and she chose the chair with its back to the wall and its face to the door, and I noticed that, and I understood it, and I did not say anything about it. A person who sits with their back to the wall is a person who has learned what happens when they don't. I put beans on. I had beans and I had cornbread from 2 days back and I had coffee, and it was a poor spread for a poor house, but I put out what I had and I put out all of it, which is a thing my wife taught me before she died. You don't give a guest the leavings, Elias, you give a guest the plate. I hadn't had a guest in so long I'd nearly forgotten the rule, but my hands remembered it. They set the table the way Martha's hands used to, and for a moment, stirring beans with my back to the room, I had to stop and breathe, because grief is like that. It doesn't come when you call it, and it comes when you're stirring beans for a stranger who's grieving worse than you ever did. We didn't talk while it cooked. She sat with her hands folded and watched the door, and I stirred the pot and watched her without watching her, the way you watch a horse you're not sure of. Through the one window I could see the corral, and I could see Smoke standing at the rail where she'd left him, head up, ears forward, facing the house. He didn't move the whole time. He stood there like he was waiting for the door to open and give her back. I set the plate in front of her. Beans, cornbread, a tin cup of coffee. She looked at it and she looked at me, and I saw the war in her, the hunger she'd walked 11 days with, against the pride that didn't want to eat a stranger's charity, against the deeper thing underneath both, which was the simple animal need of a body that has been running on almost nothing for a very long time. The body won. It always does in the end, and there's no shame in it, and I was glad to see it win. She ate, slowly at first and then not slowly. I sat across from her with my own cup, and I didn't watch her eat because a person eating that hungry doesn't want to be watched, so I looked out the window at her horse instead, and I let her have her meal in what privacy my small house could give her. When she'd finished, when she'd wiped the plate with the last of the cornbread in a gesture so automatic it told me more about the 11 days than any words could, she sat back. And she looked at me across my own table, and something in her had changed. The food had done it, maybe, or the sitting down. or the simple fact that I hadn't tried to touch her or cheat her or hurry her. Whatever it was, when she spoke again, the armor was set down beside her chair, not gone but set down, and she told me about her son. His name I still won't try to write, because I never learned to say it right, and I won't disrespect it by spelling it wrong. But she told me about him, and I'll tell you what she told me in my own poor words, and you'll have to forgive that they're poor. He was her only living child. She'd had others. They hadn't lived. That country was hard on children, hard in ways I won't detail because she didn't detail them. She just said others who did not stay and moved on, and the not detailing told me everything. He was the one who stayed. Born in a bad winter, small and loud, and she'd been sure she'd lose him too, and she hadn't. And every year past the first felt to her like a gift she hadn't earned and was afraid to be caught holding. He was, by her telling, a difficult boy and a good man. Stubborn, she used a word in her own language and then found the English for it, stubborn, and she almost smiled saying it, the way you almost smile at the memory of a fault in someone you loved past all their faults. He argued with everyone. He argued with her. He had ideas about how the world should be that the world had no intention of accommodating, and he held them anyway, hard, the way you hold a thing you know you're going to lose. And he loved that horse. The gray had come to them as a colt. She didn't say exactly how, and I didn't ask, and I've since guessed at a few possibilities and let them all lie. What matters is that the boy raised him, gentled him by hand, slept beside him in the bad weather when the colt was sick, the way she'd once slept beside the boy. She said, and this is the part I've never gotten out of my head, she said that her son used to talk to the horse about all the things he couldn't say to people. His anger, his fears. The girl he'd wanted to marry. The future he was building in his head, the one the world had no intention of accommodating. He'd sit in the dark with his forehead against the colt's neck and talk, low, for hours, and the colt would stand and take it, and in the morning the boy would be lighter. I would hear him, she said. In the night, talking, I could not hear the words, only the sound of him and the horse breathing. She looked at her hands. It was a good sound. A mother learns the sounds of her child being well. That was one of them. I thought of Smoke pressing his forehead to her chest at the fence. I thought of the low sound he'd made when she started to walk away. Don't go. And I understood, sitting at my own table, that I had spent 2 years mistaking that horse's grief for aloofness. He hadn't been aloof. He'd been waiting. Every night in my corral he'd been standing in the dark with no one to talk to him, and I'd fed him and doctored him and worked him, and never once in 2 years sat with my forehead against his neck and given him the sound of a person being well, because I didn't have that sound to give. I'd lost it myself, 11 years back, and never gone looking for it. I had to get up. I made a show of tending the stove that didn't need tending, because a man does not weep at his own table in front of a woman who has more right to weep than he'll ever have and isn't doing it. When I sat back down, she told me the rest, the soldiers, the sweep. I won't dwell on it, she didn't. She had a way of telling the worst things in the fewest words, and I've come to understand that this is what the worst things do to the telling of them. They wear the words down to nubs, because you've had to say them so many times, to yourself if to no one else, that the words go smooth and small like river stones, and you can put them down between you and a stranger without cutting your hand. The soldiers came. The people were moved. The horses were taken separately from the people. She said this was deliberate, that they knew a person would fight harder for a horse than for a wagon, and so they separated them at once. And her son, being stubborn, being a young man with ideas the world had no intention of accommodating, had done something. She didn't say what. She said he did not go quietly, and she said it with a terrible mix of pride and grief that I have never forgotten, because it was the exact mix I imagine a mother feels when her child is exactly who she raised him to be, and it kills him. They sent him to a place, far, a place for people who did not go quietly. She was sent somewhere else, and at the place they sent him there was sickness. She said the English word for it, and I flinched, because I'd seen what it did, and he was young and strong, and it didn't matter that he was young and strong. And he died there among strangers, far from her, far from the horse, far from every dark night he'd ever whispered his future into. She learned of it months later, third hand. A word passed along a chain of the scattered and the grieving until it reached her. There was no grave she could go to, no body, no place to put her hands on the earth and know he was under it. There was nothing. The world had taken her son and closed over the space where he'd been like water closing over a stone. Except the horse. The horse I could find, she said again. She'd said it at the fence, and she said it now, and I understood it was the sentence she'd built the last 2 years around, the plank she'd laid across the flood. Everything else gone, no grave, no nothing to touch, but a horse leaves a trail. A horse is bought and sold, and a man remembers a fine gray. So I followed the horse, because if I could put my hands on the horse, she stopped. Her jaw worked. If I could put my hands on the last living thing his hands made, then some part of him is still in the world. And I am still his mother, and I have not lost everything. She looked at me straight, dry-eyed now, all cried out or holding it for a more private hour. That is what I came to buy, she said. Not a horse, you understand now. I came to buy back the last place my son still lives. And there it was, the whole of it laid on my table next to the wipe-clean plate. I want to tell you what that did to me, and I find it's hard because it didn't do one clean thing. It did several dirty ones at once. It broke my heart, that first and simplest, and I won't pretend I'm too hard a man to say so. A woman had walked 11 days to put her hands on a horse, because it was all that was left of her boy, and my heart broke the ordinary way any heart would break. But underneath that, and this is the part I have to make myself right, underneath that the ledger was still running. Even then, even with my heart breaking, some cold clerk in the back of my skull was doing sums, and the sums said, Thursday, $40, one winter from ruin. She has $9 and a ring. If you give her this horse, you may not make it to spring. You have a son, too, in Colorado, who'll have to come bury you if you don't make it to spring. Is her dead son worth more than your live one's peace? That's the sum the clerk laid down. And I hated the clerk, and the clerk was not wrong, and that was the whole horror of it, that the cold voice keeping its columns was the same voice that had kept me alive and solvent and fed for 51 years, that had got me through Martha's death and my son's leaving and 11 winters alone, and I could not simply cast it out as a villain because it was also, in its cold way, trying to save me. The clerk had never once steered me wrong. The clerk was why I still had a roof. And the clerk was telling me, in its reasonable, bloodless voice, to send this woman back down the road with her $9 and her ring, kindly, with a full stomach, and keep my horse and make my sale and live. I sat at my table between my breaking heart and my accurate clerk, and I could not move. Thursday, I said, my voice came out rusty. The buyer, it's a freighting outfit out of Santa Fe. They're paying. I stopped. I didn't want to say the number. Saying the number to her felt obscene, like reading a price tag over a grave. But she was a woman who wanted facts, not softness, so I gave her the fact. They're paying $40 a head, 4 head. That money's my winter. Without it, I don't know that I make it to spring. She nodded slowly. She was not surprised. She had never once in this whole conversation been surprised by anything I said that went against her, and I've come to understand that this is what a hard life does. It takes away your capacity for that particular kind of surprise. Cruelty and refusal never surprise you. Only kindness can still catch you off guard, because you've stopped expecting it, so it comes at you from an undefended direction. Then you cannot sell him to me, she said, simply, closing the account herself so I wouldn't have to, handing me the exit. I understand this. A man must live through his winter. And she reached down for her armor. I watched her reach for it. The stone face, the folded hands, the flat voice, the readiness to stand up and thank me and walk 11 days back to a life with no grave in it and now no horse in it either. And I sat there and I let her reach for it, and I felt the whole future arrange itself in front of me like a made bed. She'd leave, I'd sell, I'd survive, and I'd carry this one Tuesday around in me for the rest of my life like a stone in a boot, a small permanent limp in my soul that no one would ever see. I could live with that. That was the terrible thing. I'd lived with worse. I could absolutely live with sending her down the road. And that, the realization that I could, was somehow the thing that finally broke me. Because here's what I understood sitting there. I understood that I had become a man who could live with things, who'd made a whole life out of being able to live with things. Martha dying, I'd lived with it. My son leaving, I'd lived with it. 11 years of a cold house and a wipe-clean plate for one. I'd lived with all of it, and I'd kept my ledger square, and I'd told myself that survival was the same as virtue because both of them let you keep breathing. But survival is not the same as virtue. I knew it the way you suddenly know a thing you've always known. A man can survive his whole life and never once do the thing that would have made the surviving worth it. He can keep every column square and die having never spent a single dollar on anything that mattered. And the ledger will balance, and the ledger will be a lie, because the biggest number on the page, the one that never got written down, is the sum of everything he could have given and didn't. I looked at her reaching for her armor. I looked out the window at the gray horse standing at the rail, facing the house, waiting for the door to open and give her back. And I thought about my own son, in Colorado, who wrote twice a year to find out if he'd have to come bury me. And I thought, if I die this winter, that boy will come down here and go through this house, and he'll find this ledger, and he'll read 40 years of a life kept square. And nowhere in it, nowhere, will there be a single line that tells him his father was a man who did one thing that cost him. He'll bury a bookkeeper. He'll never know he had a father who... Who what? I didn't have the end of the sentence yet, but I had the shape of it, and the shape of it got me up out of my chair. Don't, I said. She stopped. Her hand was on the little cloth bundle. She looked up at me. Don't reach for it, I said. I didn't fully know what I meant. My heart was going hard. That face, the stone one, don't put it back on, not yet. Just, I ran out of words and stood there in my own house with my hands empty, a 51-year-old man who'd forgot how to say a plain human thing because he'd spent 11 years with no one to say plain human things to. Just give me a minute, please. Before you fix your face and thank me and go, just sit, let me think. She looked at me for a long moment. And then, slowly, watchfully, the way you do a thing for a man who might be dangerous or might be drowning and you can't yet tell which, she took her hand off the bundle. I will sit, she said. I turned to the window so she wouldn't have to watch my face do what it was doing. Outside, the light had gone long and gold, the way it does in October when the afternoon starts thinking about being evening. The gray horse stood at the rail. He'd shifted so that the low sun caught his dapples and lit them up like coins, like the coins on her palm, I thought, like the whole worth of a life laid out in the sun. And he was facing the house, and I swear before God he was facing the window, facing me, and I stood there and I looked at that horse, and I did the arithmetic one last time. $40 a head, 4 head, my winter, my survival, my squared ledger, my son not having to come down early to bury me. Against a green ring, a dead man's knife, 4 coins, and a horse that carried the last living warmth of a boy who'd whispered his whole doomed future into its neck in the dark. The clerk in my skull laid the columns side by side, neat and square, the way he always did. And for the first time in 51 years, I looked at the clerk's tidy sums, and I understood that the ledger had been built to answer a question I was no longer asking. The ledger answered, can I survive? It had always answered, can I survive? And it had always answered, yes, and I had mistaken that yes for a life. But the question at my table that afternoon was not, can I survive? The question was, what am I surviving for? And the ledger had no column for that. It never had. 40 years of squared accounts, and not one line that could tell me what I was for. I'd built a perfect record of a life and left out the only entry that would have made the record worth keeping. I heard the chair move behind me. She was being patient. She'd given me my minute. She was, I understood, about to do the merciful thing and let me off the hook, stand up, put her face back on, thank me for the food, and carry my failure away with her so I wouldn't have to hold it. Because that's who she was. She'd carried everything else. She'd carry this too. I couldn't let her. That was the thing. I could live with sending her down the road, but I could not live with her forgiving me for it. I could not live with being one more person who'd taken something from her and been thanked for the taking. I turned around. She was standing. The stone face was half on. The bundle was in her hand. I opened my mouth to say the thing. The whole thing, take him, keep your ring. Take the horse and God go with you, and I'll find another way through the winter, or I won't. But I'll not sell you back your own son's heart for $40 I could maybe do without. That's what I meant to say. That's the man I wanted, standing there finally to be. And I want to be honest with you all the way to the end, because I promised, and a promise you keep only in the easy parts is no promise at all. What actually happened is that my mouth opened, and the whole clean speech was right there behind my teeth. And then I thought of Colorado, and I thought of the winter, and I thought of the cold, specific arithmetic of a man alone with no margin for error, and I hesitated. I hesitated. God forgive me, at the last possible second, with the words right there, I hesitated. And in that hesitation, that half a heartbeat where the coward and the clerk made their last stand, she saw it. She saw the hesitation cross my face. She knew exactly what it was because she'd seen it on 100 faces across 2 years and 11 days, the face of a person about to do the reasonable thing, the survivable thing, the squared ledger thing. And she did something I did not expect. She smiled, not bitterly, not to shame me. She smiled the way you smile at something you've finally stopped hoping for. A small, worn smile of a person laying down a weight at last. And she said, very gently, as if she were the one comforting me, "It is all right." And she set the little cloth bundle down on my table. The coins, the ring, the knife. "Keep this," she said. "For the boy's grave I have no grave, so." She pushed it an inch toward me across the wood. "You keep it when you sell him Thursday, so that some part of him is with the horse still wherever the horse goes. A ring, a knife. It is not much, but it is." Her voice finally broke, all the way. 2 years and 11 days of holding, and it broke over 3 words she couldn't finish. It is all I. It is all I. She couldn't finish it, and she didn't try again. She just stood there with the broken sentence hanging in the air of my house, her hand still resting on the little cloth bundle she'd pushed toward me, her whole 2 years' walk of held-together strength finally spent, standing in a stranger's one-room house with nothing left to hold up the wall behind her eyes. And I watched a thing happen that I have never been able to fully describe. I watched her stop performing her own survival. Because that's what the stone face had been. I understood it now in that unfinished sentence. It wasn't coldness. It wasn't strength even, not really. It was a performance. A thing she put on every single morning and wore all day and took off only in the dark, if ever, the way I put on my competence and my easy salesman's voice and my squared ledger. We were the same, she and I, in exactly that one way. We had both built a face to wear against a world that would have eaten us alive if we'd shown it what was underneath. Hers had cost her more to build than mine, because the world had come at her harder. But it was the same face. And I watched hers come off, right there at my table, not because she chose to take it off, but because she had finally, completely, run out of the strength it takes to keep a face on. And what was underneath was just a mother, that's all. Just a woman whose son was dead in a place she'd never see, whose ring and knife were on a stranger's table, who had walked to the absolute end of everything she had and found, at the end of it, one more closed door, and who was, even now, even here, trying to make that closed door easier for the man who was closing it. Keep this for the boy, so some part of him is with the horse. She'd offered me her son's last things as a gift, to ease my conscience, so that when I sold the horse out from under her, I wouldn't have to feel the full weight of it, because a piece of the boy would ride along, and it would be, in some accounting she'd invented on the spot out of pure exhausted grace, almost like she'd gotten what she came for. It was the most generous thing anyone had ever done in my house, and it was aimed at letting me commit the worst thing I'd ever have done in it. And she didn't see the contradiction, because grief that old and that deep doesn't do contradictions anymore. It just does whatever it can to make the next hour survivable for itself and, God help her, for the man refusing it. I looked down at the bundle on my table, the green ring, the bone-handled knife worn to the shape of a hand that was gone, the 4 coins. And the clerk in my skull, the cold, accurate clerk who'd kept me alive 51 years, opened his ledger one last time to write the sum. And I closed it. I didn't argue with him. That's the thing I want you to understand. I didn't win some great internal battle where the good angel beat the bad one. I just closed the book, set it down. The way you set down a tool you've used your whole life and suddenly understand you're holding for the last time. The clerk wasn't wrong. He was never wrong. He'd just been answering the wrong question for 51 years, and I was done asking him. "No," I said. She looked up. "No," I said again, and my voice didn't shake this time, and I understood that the not shaking was the whole point, that a thing said clean and steady is a different thing than a thing said trembling, and she deserved the steady one. "I'm not keeping this, and I'm not selling him Thursday." She went very still. I saw her not let herself understand me. I saw her hold the words at arm's length, refusing to let them in because she'd let words like these in before, or almost words, half words, the beginnings of hope, and been wrong, and the being wrong had nearly killed her, and she'd learned not to reach for a thing until it was fully in her hand. So I put it fully in her hand. I picked up the bundle. I folded the cloth back around the ring and the knife and the coins, careful, the way you'd wrap something that mattered, and I held it out to her across the table. "Take your son's things," I said. "And take his horse, he's yours, he was always yours. I just kept him warm for 2 years without knowing whose he was." She didn't take the bundle, not right away. She stood there and looked at it in my outstretched hand, and then looked at my face, searching it, hunting for the trick, the catch. The cruelty that surely had to be hiding somewhere in an offer this size from a man like me. "You cannot," she said, and I understood she wasn't refusing, she was protecting me one more time from myself. "Your winter, you said, you do not make it to spring." "That's my arithmetic to do," I said. "Not yours, you've done enough arithmetic for 3 lifetimes." "You have a son," she said, quietly. She remembered. I'd mentioned him Colorado the twice-a-year letters, and she'd held it, this woman with nothing. She'd held the one small fact I'd offered about my own life, and now she handed it back to me as a reason to save myself. "In Colorado, you said. If you do not survive the winter, he must come. He must bury you." And that, of all things, that is what finally broke me, fully in front of her, the way she'd broken in front of me. Because she was standing in the ruins of her own motherhood, with her son dead and ungraved and only a horse left of him, and she was worried about my son having to bury me. She was extending across the whole unbridgeable distance between her life and mine the one thing she had infinite supply of, and no one left to spend it on. A mother's care for a stranger's son, because her own was beyond her reach and the care had nowhere else to go. I had to set the bundle down on the table. My hands weren't steady enough to hold it out anymore. "Let me tell you about my son," I said. My voice had gone to gravel. "He writes me twice a year, both times to find out if I'm dying yet. And you know what I write back? I write back, I'm fine, every time. I'm fine, don't trouble yourself, I'm fine. 11 years of I'm fine, and you know why?" I looked at her. "Because I don't have anything else to tell him, because I've built a life he could read the whole ledger of and never once find his father in it. I'm a squared account, ma'am. That's all I am to that boy, a column that balances." I put my hand flat on the little cloth bundle between us. "If I die this winter, he'll come down here and bury a bookkeeper. But if I do this," my hand pressed down on the ring and the knife, "if I do this one thing, then somewhere out there's a woman and a horse who know his father was more than his sums. And maybe that's worth more to leave that boy than $40 I'd have left him anyway." She was crying now, silently the way she'd cried at the fence, but not fighting it this time, just letting it come, standing in my house, letting a stranger see the whole of it at last. "You do not owe me this," she whispered. "No," I agreed. "I don't owe you anything, that's what makes it worth doing." We buried the son that afternoon. I should explain because it wasn't a body. There was no body, there never would be, that was the whole wound of it. But she'd carried his ring and his knife 2 years and 11 days looking for a place his memory could rest. And there wasn't one. And I had 40 acres and a shovel and a horse that had loved him. And it seemed to me that a thing could be a grave even without a body in it, if the right people stood over it and meant it. So we walked out past the corral to a rise where a cottonwood stood alone, the kind of tree a person's eye goes to, and I dug a hole in the hard October ground while she stood and watched. And I dug it deep and square because if I was going to dig a man a grave, I was going to dig it right. And when it was done, she knelt, and she put the ring and the knife into the earth with her own hands. She kept the coins, I noticed that. She kept the 4 coins and buried the ring and the knife, and I understood without being told. The coins were nothing, the coins she could spend, but the ring was the love he'd meant to give a girl, and the knife was the work of his hands, and those went into the ground because those were him, and the coins were just coins. And she spoke over the grave, in her own language, long and low the way, it struck me even then, the way she'd described her son talking to the horse in the dark. Low and long and full of things I couldn't understand and didn't need to, and while she spoke, the gray horse came. I hadn't led him. I'd left the corral gate open when we walked out, not thinking, or maybe thinking without knowing I was thinking. And halfway through her speaking, I heard him, the soft fall of his hooves on the dry ground, and I turned and there he was, the big gray, walking up the rise to the cottonwood on his own. And he came and he stood at the head of the grave, and he lowered his head, and he pressed his black muzzle down toward the turned earth where the ring and the knife were, and he breathed. That long, slow, whole-body breath a horse gives. Down into the grave, like he was giving the boy the sound of a person being well one last time, the good sound, the one she'd listened for in the night. I am not a man who believes in much. My ledger was my church. But I stood on that rise in the long gold light, and I watched a horse mourn, a man he'd been separated from for 2 years, at a grave with no body in it. And I will go to my own grave believing that animal knew exactly what we were doing and exactly whose absence we were marking, and that his grief was as real and as accurate as hers, and that I had spent 2 years feeding the most heartbroken creature in that whole territory and calling him aloof. The freighter came Thursday, right on time, the way business always does. I met him at the road. 3 geldings stood saddled and ready behind me, the easy 3, sound and quiet, brushed till they shone. Smoke was not among them. Smoke was up on the rise by the cottonwood, where he'd taken to standing, near the grave, and where the woman sat in the shade with her back against the tree, resting the way a person rests who has finally, after 2 years, been allowed to stop walking. The freighter was a decent enough man, brisk and fair. He looked over the 3 and he ran his hands down their legs and he checked their teeth and he nodded, satisfied. And then he frowned and looked past me and said, "Contract was for 4. Where's the gray? Middleman said you had a gray worth 2 of these." And hereby is where the arithmetic did a thing I did not plan and did not expect. "Gray's not for sale," I said. "I've got 3, take the 3 or leave them, but that's what I've got." He didn't like it, he haggled. He reminded me accurately that the contract said 4, that he'd come a long way for 4, that 3 left him short and left me short $40 I plainly needed, because a man doesn't run an operation this thin and turn down money for pleasure. He was right on every count. He was the clerk in my skull, arrived in the flesh, standing in my road doing my sums out loud. And I stood there, and I heard myself say a thing I'd never once said in 51 years of horse trading. The gray belongs to somebody. I didn't know it when I bought him. I know it now. And a thing that belongs to somebody isn't mine to sell, whatever the middleman's papers say. So it's 3 or it's nothing, your choice. The freighter looked at me for a long moment. And then he looked past me again, up the rise, to where a gray horse stood over a fresh grave with a woman resting in the shade beneath a cottonwood. And something moved across his face. Some understanding he arrived at on his own that I didn't have to explain, and was grateful not to have to. "Papers said no history on that gray," he said slowly. "Middleman's papers, bought clean off an army scatter, no questions." He was quiet a moment. "I've seen a few of those scatters. Never did sit right with me what happens to the stock or the people." He looked back at me. "That her horse?" "Her son's," I said. "Her son's dead. It's all she's got left of him." The freighter took his hat off. I want you to know that. A brisk, fair businessman who'd come a long way for 4 horses and been handed 3, took his hat off in my road and looked up at that rise for a moment and put it back on. "I'll take the 3, he said, "and I'll pay you the 4-horse rate." "That's not," I started. "It's a delivery bonus," he said in a tone that closed the subject. "For a clean string and no trouble. My outfit can stand it." He counted the money into my hand, $160, the full 4-horse sum for 3 horses, and he swung up onto his own mount, and he looked down at me, and just before he turned to go, he said a thing I've kept. "I've bought a lot of horses off a lot of scatters," he said. "First man I ever met who gave one back." And he rode off down my road with 3 geldings on a lead, and $40 of his own money left behind in my hand. And I stood there holding it, and understood that the arithmetic I'd been so afraid of had, at the last, worked itself out. Not because the world is fair, it isn't, but because now and then one man's decency reaches out and touches another man's, and the 2 of them together can bend a sum that neither could have bent alone. I made it through the winter. In case you were carrying that, I made it through fine. She stayed 11 days. The same number she'd walked, though I don't think either of us planned the symmetry. It just fell that way, the way things do. 11 days, resting, eating, getting the strength back into her that 2 years and a long walk had taken out. She helped around the place. I couldn't stop her, and after a while I stopped trying because I understood that the helping was how she paid for a thing she couldn't stand to simply be given, and that taking that from her would have been its own kind of cruelty. She mended things I'd let go for a decade. She cooked, and it was the first food in 11 years that tasted like a person had made it for another person, instead of a man feeding himself to stay alive. And every evening she sat up on the rise with the gray horse and the cottonwood and the grave with no body in it, and she talked to him low and long, the way her son used to, and I'd hear the sound of it drifting down in the dusk, not the words, just the sound, her voice and the horse breathing, and I understood that she'd found it again. The good sound, the one she'd listened for in the night. Her son had made it once. Now she made it to the horse he'd made it to, and the horse took it the way he'd always taken it, and something that had been broken open 2 years ago began, very slightly in the evenings under that tree, to close. On the 12th morning, she was ready to go. She'd take the horse, of course. That was the whole point. She'd ride now, not walk. I'd given her a saddle, an old one of Martha's, and provisions, and one of the buried son's own coins she pressed back into my hand at the last, and I pressed back into hers, and we went round on it twice before she let me win. She had somewhere to go, kin in the end, scattered but findable, the way the horse had been findable. A place, people, a life that could be rebuilt now that she'd retrieved the one piece of it she couldn't live without. She sat the gray at the head of my road in the early light, and I stood by his shoulder, and I put my hand on his neck one last time, Smoke, that I'd called him, that had another name I never learned to say, and he turned his big gray head and looked at me with that eye I'd spent 2 years misreading, and I understood at last what the distance in it had always been. Not aloofness, waiting, 2 years of waiting, and the waiting was over. "I don't know your name," I said to her. I realized it standing there. We'd sat at my table and buried her son and shared 11 days, and I'd never once asked. And she'd never offered. And neither of those things had been an accident. Some things you hold back until the leaving, so that the name means this is who walked away from you, and not just this is who I am. She told me, "I'll not write it here, for the same reason I never wrote her son's, because I'd get it wrong, and I've gotten enough wrong in this story without adding that." But she told me, and I said it back, and she nodded that I'd said it near enough right, and that nod was worth more to me than the $160 in my box. "Elias Crane," she said, my name back to me, careful, each word a stone laid across a river. "I will tell my kin. When they ask how I found him," she looked down the road and then back at me, "I will say a man kept him warm, 2 years, not knowing whose, and when he learned whose, he gave him back, though it cost him his winter." A pause. "This is a better story than most that are told about men like you, and it is true, so I will tell it." "Tell it however you want," I said. My throat was doing the thing again. "Just tell your kin he was loved, both of them, the boy and the horse. Tell them out here there was one old fool who—" I ran out again. I always ran out right at the place where the important thing was. She waited. She'd learned my hesitations by now, the way I'd learned her armor. And when she saw I wasn't going to find the end of it, she found it for me, the way she'd found the end of everything all through, being the stronger one even now, even leaving. "Who learned at the end what he was for," she said. And she turned the gray horse down my road. I stood and watched them go. The whole length of the road, out to where it bends behind the low hills, and a thing traveling it drops out of sight. She didn't look back. She wasn't a woman who looked back. She did too much behind her worth not looking at, but the horse did. Once, at the bend, the gray turned his head and looked back up the road at the little house and the corral and the man standing in the yard, one long last look, and then he faced forward and carried her around the bend and was gone. I went inside. The house was quiet in the way it had been quiet for 11 years and hadn't been quiet for 12 days, and now was quiet again, and the quiet was different than it had been before, the same silence, but I heard it different, the way you hear a room different after music stopped playing in it. I got out the ledger. Habit, 40 years of habit. I sat at the table where she'd told me about her son, and I opened the book to that autumn, and I looked at the week, the neat squared entries, the freighter's money written in, the winter accounted for. And I came to Tuesday, the day she'd walked up my road. I'd left it blank. I told you that at the start. I've left it blank ever since. But I'll tell you the whole truth now, the way I promised, all the way to the end. I picked up the pencil that morning after she left, and I sat over that blank Tuesday for a long, long time, meaning to fill it in at last, to write down what had happened, the horse given back, the grave under the cottonwood, the woman who'd walked 11 days and rested 11 more and taken the last piece of her son home. To make an entry of it, because that's what I did with everything. I wrote it down so no one could tell me I'd misremembered. And I sat there with the pencil over the blank square, and I couldn't do it. Not because I couldn't find the words. I could have found words. But I understood, finally, sitting there, that some things you keep by not writing them down. That the ledger was for the things I was afraid of losing to forgetting. And this I would never forget, not if I lived to be 100, not if I lost every other memory I owned. This one didn't need the book. This one had gone somewhere the book couldn't reach and couldn't hold and couldn't shrink to fit a square. This one I'd carry. So I put the pencil down,